namaste everyone. Welcome to this podcast. This is your host kushalmehra. My guest today is Dr. Brian Keating. Dr. Keating is a Chancellor's Distinguished Professor of Physics at the Center for Astrophysics and Space Sciences in the Department of Physics in the University of California, San Diego. He's a public speaker. He also has a podcast which is called Into the Impossible. But today we're going to be talking about Dr. Keating's book, Losing the Nobel Prize, a story of cosmology, ambition, and the perils of science's highest honor. Dr. Keating, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, Dr. Keating, I always do this whenever I have a discussion on the book, although today's discussion is going to go maybe outside the purview of the book too. But I always start with this question with every author. Why this book? What led you? What were the circumstances where you decided, okay, I need to write about this?
Yeah. I never planned to write a book after writing a PhD thesis. It really wasn't something I was planning to do. But I always told myself, if there's ever something where only I can write a book, I will write that book. In other words, it had to be worthy of my unique imprint, imprimatur, however you want to say it. And I didn't honestly feel like that was necessary for most of my life until I was a part of and witness to an amazing event in world and scientific history. Some called it the most important discovery of all time. And I felt like the intricacies and sort of the backstory of how this came to be both so highly regarded as such an important story, the most magnificent discovery in all of time, perhaps, implicating fields as diverse as philosophy, theology, religion, as well as fundamental physics, as well as telling the story, Kushal, of an experimental cosmologist. You're probably familiar with Stephen Hawking and Brian Greene and Lisa Randall and Jenna Levin and many others that have been on my show, at least. Jayant Narlikar is just one that comes to mind. These are all theoretical cosmologists, theoretical physicists. And I felt there was a lack, there was a gap. There were no stories told by the people that are acquiring the data that allow these brilliant theorists to speculate on the origin of space, time, matter, God, etc. So I felt that was a unique opportunity, and thus I was prepared to write the book.
All right, so let's get into, because I think my duty as a podcaster, especially in India, I have a lot of young kids watching this, especially in India. We are a very young country. The average age is like 27 years, and most of the audiences of this podcast are young kids. So if I was to request you to explain, let's begin with this. Could you explain what the background imaging of cosmic extragalactic polarization is, or as you call it in the book, I don't know, we should pronounce it BICEP and BICEP 1 and BICEP 2, right?
Yeah.
So could you explain it for, let's say, the young kids who are watching this? What exactly is that?
So BICEP, this telescope, is a telescope, and all telescopes are time machines. When you look out in the universe, as long as there's nothing in your way, you can see back theoretically to the beginning of the origin of light and matter, etc. And so we knew that we could do that, and the reason to do that was on one hand it's simple, on the other hand it was quite complex. We wanted to understand by imaging this particular type of signal called the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is a pervasive glow of radio microwave energy that comes to us in all directions at all times of the year. That was discovered in 1965 by Penzias and Wilson. This signal, we wanted to know, where did it come from? And to understand where it came from, you have to go and look even farther out into space and farther back into time. And for technical reasons, you can't do that with electromagnetic radiation, with light. You can only do it with what are called gravitational waves. Waves not in the electromagnetic field, but in the gravitational field. So if I take something very massive like my own bicep and I shake it back and forth, I will generate perturbations in the gravitational field that surrounds me. Those, according to Einstein, propagate also at the speed of light, even though they're not electromagnetic radiation. So light has this wonderful property that it travels as fast as possible, but it's not the only thing that can travel at that speed. Also, certain objects called neutrinos may travel at the speed of light, and gravitational waves as well. And so it was fascinating to have this opportunity to peer back to reveal not only the current composition of the universe, but what were the conditions that prevailed during the time at which the universe sprang into existence, perhaps? And that was the origin of why I decided to propose this project called BICEP, which later became BICEP 2, in an evolutionary growth, not unlike your iPhones or your Android phones. Each model gets better than the next, than the last. So for those reasons, we built this telescope and we took it to the very bottom of the world, Antarctica. So it's also a travel journey. It's a sort of a memoir of what it's like not, to be a cosmologist looking for the experimental traces of the biggest, most important event in the universe's history.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about this now. Let's peel a little bit more. So, if I was to ask you, what was the fun bit? Conceptualizing it, designing it, or eventually getting to work on it or using it in the long term? Which process did you enjoy the most?
It's really fascinating. There's all parts of it are enjoyable and all parts of it are mundane. In other words, there's no part that's pure ecstasy all the time. Thinking of it, conceiving it, designing it, there's a lot of intricacies, there's a lot of details. Fielding it, taking it to the South Pole, that's a huge story component of my life and the book. And then acquiring data. These signals are so faint that it took 3 years to acquire them, even from the most pristine location on the planet's surface, to do so. And then it takes years of supercomputer time to analyze the data that we collected. And then finally, there's a reconciliation of the data with our theoretical hypotheses or understanding of the dynamics that could have caused these signals to originate, and also to rule out sources of confusion, of masquerading, marauding signals that could impersonate and be imposters for what we're trying to measure. And then writing up a paper, and then eventually there was quite a good deal of publicity that the leaders of the team, I had been removed from the leadership by that point, but by the time it was announced at a press conference at none other than Harvard, the reputed gold standard of all of academia around the world. So there was no time in there where it was pure joy and ecstasy, except for maybe a fleeting moment when I thought the signals would really persist and that we would indeed win a Nobel Prize. Somebody would win a Nobel Prize, perhaps. But even that moment was truly dwarfed in the large span of history by the letdown. Obviously, my book is called Losing the Nobel Prize, not winning the Nobel Prize. So the spoiler alert has to be acknowledged that the signals did not remain undisputed. And in fact, we were essentially forced to retract our claim that we had detected the first instances of the universe's birth.
All right, so now that you mentioned the Nobel Prize, now I want to talk about this. So when I was listening to your book on Audible, I always used to ask this. I clearly remember this question popping up in my head all the time. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a guy who has a business, who runs a podcast. But always, scientists are held in a certain awe. I don't know if scientists know that, but if they don't, I guess I'm letting them know that. So how does one go about living your life as a scientist? Like, we're all human beings after all. We all have goals, we all have aspirations, we all want to achieve one thing or the other. But talking about the Nobel Prize, because this book is basically about your journey where you are in doing these experiments and trying to find out a particular truth about our nature or reality in general, and you're obviously going through this process of maybe hoping that the Nobel Prize is around the corner. So what, according to you, in Sanskrit we have a word called dharma. So I don't know how would I translate it in English? I mean, what is a scientist's essence or a duty? So what exactly is a scientist's dharma then, or their essence or duty? Can they have a specific goal? Like, let's say, no, I'm going to work towards a Nobel Prize, and that's why I need to do this process or this research?
Well, I'd be lying if I said that the universe, doesn't sometimes conspire to have other means of attraction for scientists. In other words, that we are not guided by attributes other than the purest scientific goals. In the case of myself personally, I'll say that I always viewed, since I was a young graduate student, I always viewed the Nobel Prize as sort of the ultimate aspiration, because once you get to graduate school as a scientist, at least in physics, you're no longer graded, you're no longer judged, and yet you still have all these so-called finite games to complete and succeed in, where there are winners and losers, and it's not an infinite game the way that science itself is. Meaning that if you have a if you have a notion of grading in science after graduate school, it's to get a next job, which is to become what's called a postdoctoral researcher. After that, it's to become a faculty member, perhaps in my case, which is, and the odds go down, very, very rapidly. It's like, I'm sure in India, there, cricket is very popular, right? So I'm sure there are professional cricket leagues, and it's almost impossible to get to the step right below the professional club and then make it into the major leagues, or we call it baseball here. But in science, it's actually reverse. It's actually easy in a certain way, comparatively speaking, to get what's called a postdoc, and then it's almost impossible to get a faculty job nowadays. And I'm not even sure I would get a faculty job nowadays. Although when I was told by my chairman at the time that part of the reason I was hired is because they thought I had a good chance of winning the Nobel Prize. And this was by a gentleman whose father, Nikolai Basov, had won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the maser back in the 60s. So the pressures are enormous, and there is only so much funding. There's only so much attention. There's only so much regard and publicity that you can get in science, and for that reason, the Nobel Prize is sort of elevated to almost a religious-like status, as I talk about in the book, replete with all the attributes of a religion, with a founding myth, with a founding father, with a high priesthood, with holy days, one of which is coming up in October when the Annunciation is revealed of who won the Nobel Prizes this particular year. And then there's the coronation festival, held not on the day of Alfred Nobel's birth, but on the day of his death. It's kind of macabre. And you're forced to wear certain regalia, and there's flowers from his crypt that are placed there. It's all very bizarre in some ways. And yet it has become the most prestigious accolade, not only in science, you must realize, but in all the world, because the Nobel Prize winners are often asked to opine on various positions far outside of their field, which I learned recently from a guest, Ben Shapiro, is called ultra-crepidarianism, which I can't find the word exists, but he mentions it all the time. I had him on recently, and that'll come out soon. But it's people speaking outside their domain. So that's why every 4 years, 70 Nobel Prize winners sign a petition, that a certain Democrat should be president, or they might opine about the Iranian nuclear deal. And you might ask, what is a cosmologist or someone who studies superconductors? What do they know about international geopolitics? And it's this conflation that is known as the halo effect, that if you're brilliant at one thing, you should be brilliant at many things. So a famous example I use is Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein had many, many brilliant ideas in physics. And but he was also reputed to be a pretty lousy husband and father. And so we should be very careful. And he was a pacifist and an ultra anti-nationalist, meaning that it was kind of a surprise when Israel asked him to be their second prime minister. Why would you select a person whose position is antithetical towards the existence not only of your nation, but of any nation, and yet you want to make him your prime minister? So anyway, it's an example of the halo effect, and that's redounding from one of the benefits of winning the Nobel Prize. So it is a huge thing. It was for me. I can't speak for my colleagues, but I do, discuss in the book all the different ways in which the Nobel Prize is regarded as the ultimate A+, the ultimate, gold star, literal golden graven image featuring a picture of Alfred Nobel. And it's really captivated the world, not only of science, but of in all varieties as well.
Yeah, this reminds me of the halo effect working. I don't know if you would agree with me in the case of Noam Chomsky. Now, obviously, if it is in his field, which is linguistics, I have a lot of respect. But then I don't know why the American media always seems to go to Noam Chomsky about American foreign policy. I have never understood. I thought he was a linguistics expert, not a foreign policy expert. But I guess I kind of relate with what you're talking about here. But now actually, I find this very fascinating, the way you explain how the Nobel Prize is structured, the aura around it. It what does it say about the human condition that the scientific effort or the scientist has always been spoken about and showcased as this rational outside observer? The scientist is the person outside the room looking at the world as if the world is just a bunch of subjects that the scientist is going to observe, and then the scientist will sit on the high chair and give the expert opinion. But this sounds like, as humane as possible. A scientist has those same pangs and so those same aspirations, feelings of jealousy, feelings of being left out,
Mhm.
feelings of, oh my God, what am I going to do if this doesn't happen? What if I don't get tenure or track in my position? So it again comes back. Then how seriously should I take the Nobel Prize?
Well, I think it's a matter of, whether or not you feel like society as a whole benefits from venerating such awards. Nobody really venerates the Oscars. Here in America, we have the Academy Awards, right? So nobody looks to Academy Award winners on which side of an Iran nuclear deal we should take, right? It's preposterous, and yet. So it's a matter of, well, whose experts do you choose? And the famous expert Richard Feynman said of experts, he said, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. And an illustration of that is, imagine if you were, Isaac Newton, and you trusted the expert wisdom of one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Aristotle, who said that, or Galileo rather, who just trusted Aristotle and said, no, heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. So I should trust the expert, Aristotle, right? And similarly, should we trust the expertise of Galileo? No, Isaac Newton would never have come up with the inverse square law and other things if we had just trusted the laws of Galileo, because Galileo thought the tides on Earth were caused by the sloshing of water as the Earth revolved and rotated around the sun on its own axis. So that's totally wrong. But he was an expert. I mean, he was one of the greatest thinkers in human history. Similarly, Isaac Newton thought action occurred at a distance instantaneously. Einstein thought that was wrong. We now know Einstein made many. So this is the whole process that science advances, because you question the authorities. Now, I think it's so interesting that people always quote Feynman and say, "I'd rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that could not be questioned," meaning that in religion, one has to appeal to an authority that cannot be questioned. I actually don't believe that's true, and I'll give examples of that later. But then in science, we just blindly trust, oh, Einstein said this, or William Shockley, inventor of the transistor, he said this. Well, he also said that blacks are inferior to whites. So do you listen to him? Fritz Haber developed the fertilizer that feeds all of India and America. And do we listen to him? Yeah, and about chemistry maybe, but he also advocated for chemical weapons to be deployed against Allied troops as a Jewish German nationalist in World War I, and personally witnessed the killing of tens of thousands of Allied troops. So do you listen to him about international relations? Of course not. So it's ludicrous, and yet we do tend to listen and to revere those who have the Nobel Prize. And we should revere their knowledge, but knowledge and wisdom are two very different things.
I agree. I found one particular quote in your book very interesting, where you say the Nobel Prize today is a reward mechanism that discourages collaboration, celebrates authority, and sets up a rat race where claims-taking, speed, and greed are encouraged. Now, that's, for an outsider, is a very scary thought. Because again, as we say, whether we like it or not, human beings, to expect an average human being to actually go and fact check everybody's claim that is presented to them in front of their face is just impossible. Now, I'll tell you why this is even more dangerous in today's day and age, is because we live in the age of social media, where we are in in a phase where our brains are not even capable of handling the kind of opinions we are bombarded with on a daily basis now. Yeah, somebody might come back to me and say, well, it's voluntary, you can switch it off. But the point is, the entire function is based on, as they say, the refresh button is like the slot machine, and that's why you just have that rush all the time and on Twitter. But the point is, in such a scenario, with the halo effect very, very real and very much around us, how do we then check this problem? Because I want to get into religion in the latter half, so I want to now focus on this, because in the book you also talk about possible steps that we could take to fix this problem of the Nobel Prize committee. Because at the end of the day, it's not the Nobel Prize, it's the committee that's the problem. Because the prize is just a thing that you're going to get, but it's the process that is decided by the committee, right? That would be the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So yes, I'm not advocating that people should should reproduce the Large Hadron Colliders, Higgs boson discovery and everything. The average person doesn't need to do that. But if there is a mechanism within science that has as its ultimate pinnacle the Nobel Prize, then it's not science that needs to be questioned; it's scientists. And I think it is very valid to question scientists. And for that reason, I think looking at the kind of foibles and flaws of this prize, which is given by a private organization, or they can do whatever they want. Nevertheless, it does have an outsized impact on what happens in society. And so I think it's more that scientists should be questioned rather than science should be questioned. And the notion that science is done by autonomous robots who have no emotions, biases, prejudices, or peccadillos, I think that's an image of science that's sometimes cultivated within science, because we do kind of revere it in our secular age. I think we've come to have science as almost a virtue of being worshipped because it's so powerful, and because it does so much, and because it provides so much useful technology that we rely on. And yet we have almost no understanding of how most of it works, according to most lay people. So it's a shortcut, it's a hack. It's a way of saying, I don't have to put in the work, which is, fair. I don't know exactly, they say that there's no one individual or company that can make a pencil. Even something as simple as a pencil. All the steps, all the designs, all the properties. There's let alone LIGO or BICEP. These are not things that any one person can really truly comprehend. So I think it's more of having a healthy kind of skepticism, which scientists should cultivate, and they should let their foibles be known. For example, I advocate, in the book and in subsequent, talks that I've given, when we publicize things via a press conference or via a front page article in the New York Times or in Mumbai or whatever, we should also reserve some cash for a potential retraction. And that retraction should have a press conference. In other words, measure for measure, an eye for an eye, a press conference for a press conference. And in doing so, I think that'll be a very powerful way to demonstrate to people in the community that is not scientifically inclined that scientists are worthy of being trusted. Otherwise, we should do away with these press conferences, because I think that's really turning science into more of a sport than it should be.
Also, something that you touched upon in the book was the aspect where the number of women that have received the prize, and the weird process that I found, that how many members of the team are allowed to be announced. I just found that rule to be so absurd, as if you just explained to me that it's a process, and it's basically one person to the other person to the third person to the fourth person. So I forgot the name of the author. I recently read a beautiful book about how innovation works. I'm completely blanked out about the author, but that's the beauty, right? Innovation works where one piggybacks on the other, and it's a slow process. How a meme evolves. So a meme starts at point A and then it goes. So, but the Nobel Committee has like this weird rule where only X number of people are involved, and even in that, I think a few females have been left out, and the only one who got it was also because of this weird sort of a scenario. So, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Nobel Prize is a private prize that was established for the benefit of all mankind. It was established by the death of Alfred Nobel, who was a Swedish inventor who invented dynamite most famously and 354 other patents. He was one of the richest people in the world. This was a huge invention. It actually saved many lives, corresponding in contrast to his previous inventions, which usually involved, missiles and cannons and explosives for war. And so part of it was, clearly to rehabilitate the name and the image, perhaps, of the Nobel family. And it was quite successful because it's really taken over our understanding of what science is and also literature and chemistry and medicine, et cetera. So, however, he established a certain set of criteria in his will: why it was given, how it should be given, to whom it should be given. And those different criteria have been more or less ignored or modified by subsequent Nobel Prize committees long after his death. And as a Jewish person, as I am, one of the highest mitzvot, or good deeds, or it's actually literally translates to commandments, is to honor the wishes of the dead. And the reason is very simple, because when you honor the wishes of the dead, you're doing so completely selflessly. The dead aren't going to, come back, at least in my tradition, and then bury me or take care of my will. So I thought to myself, well, how would, a Jewish lawyer look at this? And I'm not a lawyer, but I looked at it and I said, what did he want, and what has it become? And would he agree with what it's become? In my opinion, no. I mean, this is just kind of counterfactual history. But he said it should go to one person for a discovery made in the previous year, and that discovery should have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind, meaning that it should have some practical purpose. Now, that doesn't mean you can't give it to theoretical discoveries, but clearly back then, most of the early Nobel Prizes were for inventions like the X-ray machine, and then discoveries like radiation, things done in laboratories, not for conjecturing the Higgs boson or something like that. I do believe that does benefit mankind in a certain way, but the notion that somehow we're respecting some of his wishes, they didn't change it that it should go to mathematics. They kept it in physics, chemistry. They did add economics, which he didn't support. And in fact, his he had no children, and so he had nephews, and they had children. His great grandnephews have basically tried to litigate to remove his name from the economics prize, which no longer is called the Nobel Prize in Economics because of their work that he was really very much against it, would have been. So there have been changes that they made that have been undone by individuals. Of course, those are very special individuals that carry the name Nobel. In this case, my agitation was for simple reforms that they could make tomorrow to give it posthumously, to give it to particular women who deserved it, that were unfairly excluded. And we know that they deserved it because their male counterparts did win the Nobel Prize for their work on the exact same projects. And then lastly, that it should go to as many people as conceivably played a decisive role in the experiment or discovery, not just 3 people. It's completely arbitrary. So if they changed it from one person that Alfred wanted to 3 people, there's no reason we can't change it to as many people as participated. Except, Kushal, you have to think, why are they not making these reforms? That even the Nobel laureates I speak to on my podcast, I've interviewed 10 of them so far. I have a new book coming out by the time this is out called Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner. And I interviewed 9 Nobel laureates for that book. And almost every single one of them says, no, the Nobel Prize should be given to as many people as possible that participated in the discovery. And so this is something that the winners are claiming they want to have reformed, and yet they won't do it. Now, you have to ask yourself why. I don't know why. I speculate in the book as to why, but for now, it has not changed.
That's fascinating. It's actually indeed fascinating. Now, so just for the record, the book was by Matt Ridley, How Innovation Works. I had blacked out then, but yeah, I just remembered the name, so I thought I'll share. So now, Dr. Keating, I want to now divide the latter half into 3 parts. Now, this may not necessarily, it's not entirely disconnected from your book, because your book is also a lot about your personal journey as a person, as a human being, also a lot about your beliefs. But let's start here. As far as, so I remember having a chat with Karan Jani a while ago, and I had asked Karan this question too, where I was like, do you think as of now, physics as a field, or maybe understanding the nature of the cosmos, do you think there is a string theory bias in the field itself?
I definitely think there is a notion of bias that is coming from intrinsically perhaps humanistic reasons. In other words, based on our perceptions, based upon our desirable features of academic or abstract theoretical physics. Yes, there are sort of concessions that people have mentioned. This goes back to the 90s and even earlier, when string theory was still in kind of full gear and had, at least at that point, passed all tests that could conceivably or plausibly be proposed. And it's a very old idea. I did several videos about string theory on my channel, where I just go into the details as an experimentalist of what a string theory that is viable should preserve and what aspects should it encompass. And in so doing, I look at the attributes of experimental testability. I look at the explanatory power. How many assumptions does it make? How few things does it require to explain those things? And in almost all cases, I find it very hard to really substantiate the durability of string theory after not passing. Let's just say not passing. I don't want to say failing so many tests, but let's just take the biggest one of all. String theory posits that to unify the forces of nature, the nuclear, electromagnetic forces with gravity, it can only be accomplished in 10 or 11 dimensions, meaning that in addition to the 3 spatial dimensions that we know and love, up, down, left, right, backwards, and forwards, there are actually 7 or maybe even 8 more dimensions, or 6 or 7 more dimensions, and we can't. Now you have to explain why we don't see those dimensions, why we don't encounter those dimensions. And so then you have to hide the evidence. So you have to say that, oh, no, these dimensions only exist at incredibly small scales. And then these scales, at first could be tested by very large, powerful microscopes like the Large Hadron Collider. And then when that was failed to observe, we have to then say, no, they're actually much smaller than that. And so you start with this very big, goal of unifying the laws of physics, which itself is motivated by past successes. One in particular, unifying electricity and magnetism as 2 sides, literally, of some kind of a coin, where they're actually just the same phenomenon in a different garb. And when we look at that, we have to, say, well, what is the gain divided by the inputs? And in string theory, it's very, very large. And this has been going on for over 100 years. People looking for additional dimensions that would cause a simplification and therefore compactification of the laws of nature. And I've had on many scientists on my show, and including Kamran Vafa and people like Michio Kaku and many, many others. And, to date, they have not yet really convinced me that there are novel predictions that would not have been predicted, and that we should preserve, string theory as it is, at least, without severe modification. There are other aspects of string theory that require, things that we know not to be true. Not only that we can't see them, that they're actually wrong. A certain type of acceleration of the universe is predicted by string theory. We observe the opposite. Instead of deceleration, we observe acceleration. These would be killers to almost any other theory, of electromagnetism. If you predicted there should be all these magnetic monopoles floating around, and we don't see those, then I think it would be quite astounding that people would still have confidence in electricity and magnetism.
Yeah. Another thing that has always, and you could dismiss this question, but I don't know, just again, as an outsider, something that has always perplexed me is the lack of experimentation. Because you are someone who does experiment all the time, what I see is a lot of models and a lot of advanced math, and the math is sound, the math is sound, the math is sound. That's all I hear all the time. But really, when it comes to, as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I don't know, Floyd Mayweather would always say that as a boxing fan. So I somehow feel a lot of these claims when it comes to physics actually do not get into that next level. And you, as someone who actually does get into the business of testing a lot of things, do you feel a sense of frustration at times?
I do and I don't. There are valuable, aspects of studying things that can't immediately be tested. And the question is, how long do you allow it to survive? And again, this is a reason that I feel it's important to hear from, let me say, non-theorists, like the Brian Greens and the Stephen Hawkings, et cetera. We need to hear more from experimentalists, because you really can't keep an experiment going year after year if it's not working, if it's not provable, if it's producing incorrect results in conflict with the other previous scientific literature, it's not passing peer review, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, when I think back to the 1800s, when electricity and magnetism were first unified by a famous Scottish physicist by the name of James Clerk Maxwell, he posited that the waves of electricity and magnetism were conveyed through a medium, called the ether later, and that furthermore, there was actually, at a very small scale, there were these little tiny whirlpools and gears that allowed a wave to propagate from right to left. It would be these little microscopic gears, submicroscopic. You can't even see them, he said, and they'd be so small. And we of course know that's ludicrous. There are no gears in space made of crystalline ether. But imagine the penalty if we had thrown out that baby with that bathwater, and we would have been delayed and deferred the progress of history in physics and beyond, for technology depends upon the laws of electromagnetism, for decades, as we wait to see, oh no, he's been falsified and therefore it's not good science. I think that's kind of poor. I will say that folks such as my friend Jayant Narlikar, who still maintain the status of the steady state universe, effectively, not a Big Bang. He's still a vocal critic of the Big Bang, as was his PhD advisor, Fred Hoyle. That there are, there are aspects of that theory that he and his mentors and friends and colleagues provided, the quasi-steady state theory, that are virtuous and they have some validity, and maybe even led to some discoveries and predictions that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. So it's important to even have a theory that you believe is wrong, but keep it around for a little bit of time in order to fully steelman, if you will, the opponent's theory, because I think that's the best way to get at the truth.
Yeah, and I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed your chat with Jayant Narlikar and Mangala Narlikar. That was interesting, and I love the way how she telling the questions. It was awesome. And the last bit where she because she's so good in her own way, because she's a mathematician and she's so recognized in India. So it was a lot of fun to listen to them. But this question that you're talking about, that again, obviously, when I use the word orthodoxy in science, is very different from a religious orthodoxy. I don't literally mean it to be like a religious orthodoxy. An orthodoxy in science is basically, a point of view that most scientists seem to agree upon, but it is obviously based on the scientific process. But do you think there is real merit in having these parallel ideas of how the cosmos actually came about, in that sense, in real sense?
Yeah, I do. I think that there are, because of the inscrutability of the early universe, because we can't really measure or even go back in time and observe this, even with a telescope, we can only observe the aftershocks of that event. And there's plenty of evidence for the Big Bang as a Big Bang, but not necessarily as the beginning of the universe. And even Jayant and Fred Hoyle and others would admit that there's, we have to, and in fact, Fred and Jayant played a huge role in this, and, along with his colleague Taylor, back in the early 60s, showing that you couldn't make enough helium, which we observe in the sun, and that's why it has the name helium, that you couldn't make enough in stars alone. And actually, Hoyle helped to establish that, and Narlikar later, that this process was insufficient, and you needed to produce something at an earlier stage in the universe. The problem that I think a lot of cosmologists have, and that they've fallen into a shortcut of thinking about it, is that the Big Bang is the beginning of time. And there's nothing that says there was one single Big Bang. There's nothing that says that the Big Bang was the beginning of time. And there's nothing that says that the evolution of the universe couldn't be cyclical in a certain sense. These are all still, as we say, going concerns. These could all still be possible. And so for that reason, the confrontation of this idea starting 55 years ago now, that this is extremely valuable. And I still think there is a place for this in science, as did none other than Karl Popper, philosopher of science and other matters, that he thought the steady state was preferable because he said it was falsifiable. And for that reason alone, I think there's a virtue in keeping around ideas that may not be correct ultimately. And that is arguably one reason why I think it's not necessarily anathema to physics to keep string theory going as well. I do think there are aspects of string theory that it's just too early to evaluate, and so throwing it out now would be a disservice.
So yeah, now so you just mentioned Popper. So now let's get into the next part that I wanted to ask you. Now you touched upon this at least on two podcasts that I've heard. I'll be honest, I've not heard each and every discussion here, but I clearly remember you discussing this twice. Obviously, you asked this question to Dr. Narlikar, but you also discussed this in a discussion in a chat with Lawrence Cross, if I remember, and you spoke about, I don't know, I think your question was, why do people hate philosophers so much? and as a humble student of philosophy myself, who reads philosophy all the time, I've never understood this. Now, I always hear Dr. Gadsad in Canada. He always talks about a nomological network of cumulative evidence, where basically you take the evidence from as many places as possible, and then you form your hypothesis, you test your hypothesis, and then it becomes a theory. Why do you think there is this allergy? I don't know if allergy is the right word, but I'll still use it. Why do you think there is this allergy to a multidisciplinary approach, especially when it comes to philosophy?
Well, I think that there's a notion that philosophy, and by the way, this is very old. I have a quote in my book from Galileo where he kind of mocks philosophers for theorizing and cogitating without looking at actual evidence. But I think so. I think this is old as time, and arguably you look at things like philosophy of Aristotle. When it was applied to natural sciences, almost everything he said was wrong, except for perhaps the existence of mammals as whales as mammals. That was certainly true. But he did so by observation, but he didn't observe that heavy things fall faster than light ones, because they don't. So I think it's a complicated question. There's historical aspects of it. Physicists do not make good philosophers. Physicists don't look typically at philosophy, because their notion is, as David Merman would say, shut up and calculate, do something, don't just stand there. And, I think it's important to realize that, we have our biases, our own particular flaws, et cetera. And, maybe a blind spot is not recognizing the value of philosophy, which I actually love. I love thinking about.
All right. So now I wanted to talk to you about something that you've mentioned a number of times on your podcast, or you even spoke about this with Michael Shermer. So you call yourself a practicing devout agnostic. Now, could you explain what a practicing devout agnostic is, and why are you that?
Well, I think it's, from my perspective, scientifically speaking, there's no way to prove the non-existence of God. There's no way to prove the existence of God either. So in a certain sense, we're all agnostic, but which means, as Michael points out, it's not knowable. It's not that you don't know and you're kind of wavering back and forth. It's that the fundamental truth is not knowable. Now, I'm also a pragmatist, meaning that my behavior is, representative of my philosophy or my orientation. And I think that too many people will be glib and say that they're atheists, or say that they're agnostic, or say that they're theistic, and really they're not. In other words, they're atheists who are deeply religious. It's just their religion is Mother Gaia, or the Nobel Prize, or some other phenomena that they dedicate their life to. There are theists, on the other hand, who believe in Jesus Christ, but actually their religion is more political. They're on the far right, or perhaps they have authoritarian leanings on that side. And then there are agnostics who say they're agnostic, but actually their behavior is indistinguishable from an atheist. You never get an agnostic who goes to church every single week, and yet you should. At least I've never really encountered that. Freeman Dyson late great Freeman Dyson was my first podcast guest on the Into the Impossible podcast, and he used to call himself an agnostic. And I would say, well, Freeman, imagine an alien. Some of my friends think there are aliens that are visiting us, and I've done a lot of podcasts about that. But anyway, imagine an alien comes to Earth and then meets you and doesn't want to eat you, but he says, what is your belief in the origin of the universe and humans, and is there a higher power as some other human? And he would say, yes, I think there's a possibility that they exist. And then the alien would say, well, I know that there are certain people that believe affirmatively in the existence of God, and they go to church every Sunday, and they practice, or they go to temple every Saturday. I notice you don't do that. So how are you functionally, practically, behaviorally different from Richard Dawkins or Michael Shermer or somebody like that? How do you demonstrate via your behavior to an independent third-party observer that you are actually in a distinct category class? And I said, you don't. So and I did it respectfully. I wasn't a jerk to the guy. He's one of my friends and heroes. But I did say, for me, that means for me, I do have to practice a version of it, even though all the while I am questioning. So my religion is Judaism. And Judaism has a notion of a holy trinity, just like Christianity does, and it's a God and the Torah, which is the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, and Israel, the sanctity, the special place that Israel has. Now, the word Israel in my language, you explained to me the meaning of your language, podcast title, I think it's beautiful. In Hebrew, the language of Judaism, the word Israel means wrestles with or fights with God. Eloheinu is the name of God in Hebrew, and Yisro means to fight. It doesn't mean to submit, as some other religions have it. And so you're always supposed to be wrestling, fighting, questioning, and also, looking for the attributes and possibilities to strengthen your faith, not to prove God, or to, question your faith, not disprove God, because I think those are fundamentally impossible constraints, as does Richard Dawkins. So for me, being a practicing devout agnostic means taking the religion seriously enough to engage in its rituals, to engage in its practices, to engage in its history, its cultural aspects, as many Jews do, but also take it seriously. Learn the language, learn Hebrew and Aramaic, which is not easy to do when I started at age 30, and also to attend services, to seek out teachers. I mean, I told this to Lawrence Krauss. He's a militant atheist. He calls himself a militant atheist. So I said, Lawrence, did you? First of all, I explained to him this notion about Israel, and he said he never knew that. And I said, well, it's not really a surprise. You stopped learning about God and Judaism at age 13 when you had this ritual known as the bar mitzvah in Judaism, commemorating the transition to adulthood of a young man or woman. And you had that experience 45 years ago or whatever, and you no longer feel you have the need for it. But on the other hand, Lawrence, I don't think that you would accept a book critique by a 13-year-old. In other words, why are you so willingly neglecting any possible benefits, traditions, cultural contributions of the religion that you happen to be born into? And obviously, I was born into it. If I was born into being Hindu, I'd probably be Hindu. But the point being, you are accepting the invalidation, the disproof of the existence of any validity of your tradition from a 13-year-old. And you would never do that based on one of your theories from a 13-year-old physicist or philosopher, heaven forbid. And he agreed with that. But I think it's a little cavalier that people do kind of throw around these terms, including that they believe and then they might act abhorrent. I mean, there are plenty of examples of Jews who are outwardly very pious and believing, and they're not people I would want my children to emulate. So that's a long-winded way of saying what philosophically I think it means to me. And if you like, as I say in the book, it's kind of a version of Pascal's wager, right? If God exists and you don't believe in or don't act in some way, maybe there'll be some punishment. But in this case, I don't feel there's any harm in investigating the intellectual, religious, and cultural traditions of the religion you're born into. And I actually have a benefit because my mother and father were divorced, and I was actually exposed to Catholicism. I was actually an altar boy, and I never had a bar mitzvah in my whole life. I plan to do one in a couple of years when I turn 52, which will be the fourth anniversary of that event. But nevertheless, I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church instead, learning about Jesus Christ and the apostles and the New Testament. I never read the Old Testament until I was 30 years old. So for all these reasons, I think it's important to take it seriously. And it's like, I don't fight with a 4-year-old. I fight with someone equal and opposite to me. I do martial arts, and the most fun thing to do is to wrestle and grapple and do stuff with someone who's your skill level. Not going to destroy you and is much bigger than you. But so why not do that with the most arguably and most important notions of all, which is how did the universe come to be?
So Jordan Peterson often says that he cannot prove that there is a God, but he chooses to live his life assuming there is one. I obviously would not put you in that category because you do not live your life assuming there is a God. You live your life assuming you don't know or you can't know. Like I live my life in a mode where I say I don't care because I believe it doesn't add or subtract any value, but I do get it because I do, myself participate in Diwali festivities in my house. If there is a ceremony where we call it the puja, I will participate in it. I even go to a temple once in a while, once in a year. I like the ISKCON temples. I just like the whole song and dance and the entire atmosphere. So I do understand. So my last question to you, and then we'll wrap it up, is I'll give you my rationale behind it. So I remember all new atheists, and I use the word with full responsibility. New atheists use this story all the time, and the story is you have a nuclear holocaust, everything gets destroyed. Then suddenly, some human beings who survive, they're just going through the rubble of humanity, and suddenly they find these comic books of. And I've used this example multiple times on the podcast, but I think you'll like it. And then you find these comic books. So, and the new atheist tells you, what are those people going to do? And the natural answer is they'll take their gods. And they're like, see, religion is fake. And I don't get it. My answer to them is, see, that's the most natural thing they come to every time after every destruction. So what does it say about the human condition and the strength of religion? I don't know. Am I wrong?
Well, I actually agree more with you, but I think the counting it as a comic book and a fairy tale and a fable, that's intellectually dishonest of them. Meaning that I don't know any comic book that requires that I honor my father, even though he wasn't a perfect father, even though he abandoned me. I don't know of a comic book that tells me, oh, you should really honor your father. No, the comic books tell you, go out and kill your father, avenge his death. Or one that tells me, my enemy, not my friend, not my name, my enemy, somebody that I don't like, and I see him struggling in the street to, do something, I am forbidden to walk away from him. I actually have to help him. And you see this and all these laws. I mean, did Marcus Aurelius say all the things that he said, reputed to say? Did the Buddha, did he say all the Eightfold Way? Do we know? Do we care? Isn't there incredible value in it beyond any comic book created by human beings? And maybe it was, human. I'm obviously not a Buddhist, but the point being, there's a moral and ethical implication of accepting upon yourself the yoke of heaven, as they say, even if you don't believe. It makes you a better person. And there's almost nothing else like that. There's nothing like, you might believe, in my country, we have a founding father, George Washington, and there's a myth that he never told a lie. And there, he chopped down a chair. Yeah. Okay. Is there any harm in believing it? I don't know if he said it. Is there any harm in believing it? No. But also, is there any good in believing it? Well, maybe a little bit. But is there good in the commandment that I give away 10% of my post-tax income? Of course there is. Tithing. Where is that? Where does Sam Harris get his, ability, or what? How much charity does he feel willing to give? I don't know. Maybe he does a lot. I'm just saying the notion that you can't not give is a very old and good part of religion, and I think that is that is benefit in enough. And in my religion, by the way, you're familiar with the 10 Commandments, probably. Just as I'm familiar with the Eightfold Way, maybe. But there's 613 commandments, actually, that are commanded. And some of them are very frivolous. Like, if you come upon a mother bird and she's sitting on a nest, you may not take the nest of eggs. You may not take the nest from her with the eggs inside without removing her from the scene, because it will cause her trauma. Who cares about some bird, literally bird brain? No, it's not for the bird. Come on. It's for you. And so I think if there are things like that that appeal to the logical side, I can overcome some of the things that seem illogical, fanciful, or as your friends say, comic book almost in nature.
Yeah, so I guess that's what Pascal Boyer always says, the suprasensory effect that religion provides, right? And it's just and which sport cannot, or maybe music cannot provide in the way religion provides to maybe a post-agricultural society. So yeah, I agree with you. In fact, at a personal level, I'm probably as godless as it gets. I don't know, I don't know how to put it, but I still, like new atheists hate me. They're like, you're a traitor to the cause. You I don't even call myself an atheist. Like I have a whole monologue where I say why I don't call myself an atheist. I
Right. Yeah,
refuse to use that tag.
yeah.
So I don't, I still call myself a Hindu. I believe I'm a member of the community, and I don't want to be clubbed with the atheists. So Dr. Keating, once again, thanks for coming on the podcast. I'll leave you with the last words. So take it up
Well,
from here.
yeah, the last word I'll say is I have a new book coming out called Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner. It's available in India and everywhere else, and it will be out on September 28th. And it reveals not the knowledge of 9 Nobel laureates, but their wisdom and their struggles. And it's an attempt to humanize them. There's an old joke that how do you know a scientist is outgoing? Because he looks at your shoes when he talks to you. And I wanted to illustrate that these are human beings, not just these godlike figures, and as exemplified by the fact that they all have self-doubt. They all suffer from what we call the imposter syndrome. And if they can suffer it after winning the Nobel Prize, we should learn how to do it and to confront it and deal with it for the benefit, not of all mankind, but for our own personal benefit, if nothing else. And I want to thank you. And I hope someday we can go to both a synagogue together and to a Hindu temple. That'll be really fun for me.
All right. Okay, guys, time to wrap today's discussion up. The links to buy Dr. Keating's book are going to be in the description of the podcast. It doesn't matter if you're watching this video or later on in the audio version. You can go and buy them. Please follow him on Twitter and go and subscribe to his YouTube channel and podcast on all the platforms. It's an amazing platform. You find a lot of interesting discussions. Check out the ones with Eric Weinstein. You'll like it a lot. Eric is quite a hit in India, so I can recommend that. I'll wrap today's discussion up over here. Please subscribe to the channel, like the video. You know the drill. So become a member, Patreon, all the stuff. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste. Take care. Goodbye.